Thank you all. It's lovely to be here amongst so many people whose work I've admired for a long time and are doing such great service for the country and for important causes. So unfortunately for you, I'm the second philosopher you'll hear from today, unfortunately for people who don't like that sort of thing. And one of the things that we do is to try to kind of carve nature up at its joints and carve ideas up at their joints and so forth. And you might not necessarily like the way in which I joined this particular chicken, but the idea is that our language needs to be clear when we're talking about emotive issues, because these things do result in hot contestation, and one quickly loses each other in debate and discussion. And the chance for any kind of progress or resolution is compromised not only by disagreement of ideas, but by the fact that we're talking about different things, and we're not quite even aware of that. So I'm going to talk about some concepts that are interesting to me in this debate, including ethical ones and religious ones, to try to clarify some of those things. Because this debate in particular involves sacred values, and as soon as you talk about sacred values, I mean, I'm a devout secular humanist, if that's even a thing, but so sacred values, what do they mean to a person like me? And to a person like me, at times of death or suffering, they might mean things like companionship and being with my friends and family and so forth. So it would be a tactical mistake, I think, for me to dismiss or to be rude towards the idea of sacred values as expressed in a religious perspective, right? Because we're talking about different things, but we all understand the emotional connection that's being discussed, right? So it's a matter of how one talks about these things if you care about persuasion rather than just being right, which I think too many people are simply concerned about the being right aspect rather than about the persuasion aspect. So on the sacredness point, clearly here we're talking about that thing that's called the soul, because if you cared about life being sacred in all respects, you'd be a Jain or something like that, and you wouldn't trod on ants, right? Because if life is sacred, then that's a generic claim. All life has to be sacred. So this claim in terms of end-of-life decisions relates to this thing called the soul, which of course one can caricature as that slide somewhat does. But so the soul raises the stakes, is the point I want to make here, because one thinks that one is ending the life not just of Bob, but there's this eternal soul that's perhaps judging you for having ended the life, right? So there's this tether between the physical and the spiritual, and I've got to keep this Bob alive. I've got to keep Bob alive because he might be watching me and judging me. But the answer to that, or the thing to remind people of there, is that Bob might just as well be judging you for keeping you alive, saying, damn it, I'm suffering here, can't you see that? It's time for me to go. So it doesn't answer the question to say that there's this ethereal soul, Joe's essence or Bob's essence, that is potentially going to be judging you. But my point around the sacredness thing is to say that this debate, and not people in this room, but as it's played out in the popular mind and media, is often characterized by the pro-end-of-life liberty advocates being quite callous and unsentimental about these things. And I'm just pointing out that I think that is a communicative and a tactical error when people do that, because it immediately alienates the exact people we need to try to persuade. The people like, for example, this is from a guy called Ben Shapiro, who's a conservative. I don't know what to call him that isn't too flattering. Conservative, let's call him a person in America. And the point is that the idea is that facts and feelings can be compatible, right? We can care about both of them at the same time. But people who advocate for causes like ours are sometimes in this kind of camp, where they say, look, it's just about the data. Do you see any brainwaves? Or does anybody care? Or what is the inheritance? Or whatever. You know, that kind of language or those kinds of thoughts are an immense disservice to an enormously important thing in which we can have as much commitment to the idea, as I say, of the sacred and of those emotional realities as everybody else. So let's clarify some of these terms I was talking about. Early on today, you did hear a little bit about the right to life. I just want to rule this out in a sense as a relevant concept. I'm not talking about constitutional law or anything like that. I'm talking just about the concepts in a philosophical sense. The right to life is not, to me, a very highly relevant concept in this debate because you're killing yourself. I mean, that's why it's called assisted suicide. It's not the right to life confers on other people a duty to not kill you, right? Suicide is not an illegal thing. Here you are getting somebody to assist with that. So I'm not too concerned with right to life. I am concerned with separating these things because opponents of our dignity and freedom here like to conflate these things. Suicide, as you know, is self-inflicted. Euthanasia is ending life intentionally without consent, like we do with our pets, right? They can't consent. And then dying with dignity, what we're mostly talking about here today, is neither of those two things. It's the idea of taking the individual's ultimate and final, perhaps, expression of choice seriously and respecting it. Okay, so it's a deeply life-affirming thing to do, rather than a life-ending kind of thing to do. Thirdly, this is not a generalized preference for dying over living. It's not as if, I mean, some of us might want to, but it's not as if most of us actually would like to be at the point where we have to make this decision. So it doesn't express a general emotional commitment to the idea that death is preferable over life. Under certain circumstances, it becomes so. And at that point is where one needs to respect that decision. But it's not a general attitude that one prefers death over life. Then it's also a commitment to dignity and respect. An adult of sound mind and body should have their decisions respected. We've got no problem with that in terms of how we live our lives, but for some reason we start having a problem with that when it comes to choosing how we should die. What counts as good reasons for making this choice? And here you and I might differ, all of us in the room. Even if we agree on the general principles, we might disagree on this. I might think, for example, that just being bored is a good excuse or is a good reason. And in fact, I do think this is the case. I think if one has had enough of life, that's enough of a reason to end one's life. You might say it needs to be a diagnosis with X months to live. Wherever you draw the line, there's an important debate to be had here around what counts as good reasons. And as one is having this debate, of course, one has to start out conservative, and one would want to start out conservative and perhaps ever stay conservative. But this is a really interesting and difficult debate to have. Of course, we would want to say that just having frostbite, for example, is probably not sufficient in most people's minds, right? But we can disagree on this. But as a starting point for clarity on this conversation, I just want to point out that when we think about killing versus letting die, the discussion is perhaps colored or influenced by the fact that when you think about killing, you think about gruesome murders on television and film and whatever it might be. You don't think of it as a medical option. So just like palliative care, for example, is now thought of as a form of medical treatment rather than just helping you to not suffer until you die. It's actually a branch of medicine in a sense. In the long term, we might think of assisted dying in exactly the same kind of way. And that's the direction in which we need to push the debate and away from these conversations which involve celebrating death, which allows the opponents to caricature this debate. So some misconceptions. Tom Beauchamp, who some of you might have heard of, a philosopher, wrote a great book in 1985, I believe, in which he expressed this thing called the wedge argument, which presents what you would know as the slippery slope idea. That if we allow for, in this case he was talking about active euthanasia, if we allow for active euthanasia, we're going to introduce a slippery slope whereby the value of life gets eroded, and today we'll be saying, yes, it makes sense when this person has stage 4 cancer to end their lives, or let's say that they've got locked-in syndrome and they can't express their wishes, that it's okay to actively euthanize them. But tomorrow it might be the inconvenient grandmother who's just too whiny, or whatever it might be. So there's this progression towards eroding the quality of life, or the value of life, and people becoming more and more callous towards it. This immediately strikes me as implausible, because I don't think you would find many doctors who would look for opportunities to kill people. Okay? So it seems to me to speak against a fundamental psychological reality of humans. I mean, apart from the Harold Shipman sort of counterexamples, most doctors are not like that. Secondly, we would have thought 200 years ago that the suggestion that we should allow women to vote was obscene. Not we, I mean we as in men, rather than we as in humans, right? Because that's the exact nature of the discrimination I'm talking about. One might have thought that you should be opposed to gay marriage. Today, people are saying that it might be immoral for you to eat meat. In 50 years' time, we will probably all agree that it's immoral to eat meat. Okay? So that's this political concept of the Overton window, where you start at these extremes, and gradually over time, one cottons onto the fact that there was something in that, and you nudge what's normal slowly, steadily over the years, until everybody finds this new consensus. It strikes one as absurd and obscene when it's introduced, but if you are a utilitarian, as I am and I imagine many of you are, and you care about minimizing suffering, it will start to become self-evident that there are going to be many cases in which you could minimize suffering by ending lives. And most of you in the room think that that's obvious, but I think many people all over the world will think that's obvious. It's going to become, in a sense, the norm. And of course, we need to make sure that we, in terms of protecting ourselves from the slippery slope and this wedge, introduce legal constraints around how to do it. And we can, again, differ on what those constraints should be, how strict they should be, how many people should be involved in the conversation, etc. But I'm just expressing the principle, which you can hopefully agree with, that we can find some way of building in a robust set of rules. And the point about that is that, of course, there are going to be mistakes. Of course, there are going to be exceptions, or occasions rather, in which this situation is exploited and somebody has their life ended non-volitionally and for somebody else's perhaps financial advantage. But you cannot judge policy by its exceptions or by its abuses. If on the whole it's shown to be successful and life-affirming and helping people out of pain, etc., the rare exceptions, if you craft your regulations that the exceptions are rare, those are not an argument against the overall value and virtue of that policy. Religious discourse, I think, often misleads us here because they use this language. This is Jean Hill from the Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City. Let us help people understand that they won't be alone, that we won't abandon them. The language here privileges the idea of staying alive at all costs, that it's an abandonment to let you die. That's the mindset that we need to change. The point is that if you leave me to suffer, and I cannot express my suffering and my desire to have my life ending, that is the abandonment. That is the lack of respect for my wishes. That is the lack of respect for my dignity. So that's the mindset that is our problem and that we have to challenge. You can have fears about death, of course, but you can still want to die regardless of that. Okay? It's not irrational to be afraid of it. It's not irrational to be afraid of something yet still desire for it to happen. You can't take the fear as evidence that you don't want it to happen. The other concern I have for this is that Jean Hill's sentiment, in the end, I don't know if any of you have read Immanuel Kant, but the idea of the categorical imperative of treating people as means rather than ends. This is an example of that. I am expected to service your values and your virtues by staying alive for as long as you decide I should. Okay? I'm acting out your values in the world rather than mine when that's the case. And that's odious. That's morally deeply odious. The problem is this is going to become even more of a situation, even more of an evil as the years go by. We will perhaps reach a point where we can be kept alive indefinitely, no matter what our condition is. Okay? So at some point, we're going to have to grapple with this just practically, of course, because all the hospital beds will be full, and you'll be all, unless we keep ourselves in vats, just the brain, then of course we could space for many. We could stack ourselves on top of each other and stay alive forever. To what end, though, right? I mean, you should have a chance to opt out. But the problem is going to get more and more acute as time goes by. If we think we have a problem now, it's just going to get worse. Earlier today, somebody was talking about the problem of, sorry, I'm going to come back to that. What do we do when we don't know what somebody wants? So if you can't express your wishes. At these end-of-life decisions, this is now Jonathan Glover, another philosopher, said we can either take all possible steps to preserve life. And even people who are opposed to assisted dying would normally grant that this is not a reasonable point of view because it involves a resource constraint. We don't have the resources to keep everybody alive no matter what the cost at all times, right? If I'm taking all steps to preserve life for you, somebody's going to die of influenza that I could easily have treated. You've got to at some point do some kind of cost-benefit analysis. A second kind of option is to say we take all ordinary steps to preserve life, but no extraordinary means. I'm sure you can immediately see the massive subjectivity in that, right? So what counts as extraordinary and what counts as ordinary? And of course, you collide with the same resource constraint as in the first one. I mean, no matter where you pick that subjective line, you'll still be able to find cases in which you could have done something else, right? So that doesn't really help our problem. Step 3, or option 3, not killing but taking no steps to preserve life. You're familiar with this idea, I'm sure, where we let, in a sense, nature take its course. The acts and emissions doctrine is what you'd perhaps know it as. This rests, to my mind, on what is a moral placebo, or a moral salve, or something like that, as it were. Because if you know somebody is going to die, and it's going to take them a day or a few hours, whatever it might be, it seems unclear to me what would stop you from assisting that death, right? Apart from, if you have religious persuasions, of course, but more importantly, legal fears, which is what we were talking about, what Deirdre was talking about earlier on, letting people have the option without the fear of those repercussions. And a denial of responsibility. I just don't want this on my hands. And that's absolutely fine. I can respect people not wanting to do it. All I'm saying is that this isn't a principled distinction. Just say that, it's just going to happen, and I will refuse to accelerate it. And point 4 has got a similar kind of flaw, taking actions which, while not intended to kill, have death as a foreseen consequence. The doctrine of double effect, which Catholic scholars are very fond of. That, again, seems to me a massive case of sophistry or doublespeak. Because if you can foresee death, it again seems unreasonable to not just cause death, right? I mean, you know that it's going to happen. You can say, well, I don't intend for it, I just intend to relieve pain. That seems to me like a way to just evade responsibility. Finally, there's the deliberate act of killing, which is an act of kind of euthanasia, or in a case where somebody can't consent but is given an advance directive, it might be an assisted suicide. As I've been saying, 3, 4, and 5 are morally, to me, quite indistinguishable. They're just ways of talking about these choices which allow ourselves to feel better about them. But they aren't morally different, to my mind. We've heard lots about these two men today, Stransham Ford and Ambrosini. Just briefly going back to that Supreme Court of Appeal judgment, some of it which has been mentioned earlier on. The ruling said the High Court's notion of a dignified death is not informed by a rounded view of society. The same could be said about this judgment. And as we were hearing earlier on, the idea that one can say that a particular culture or a particular group of people have this view is deeply infantilizing and patronizing. And you'll find exceptions within any community of people who want something and people who don't want something. So the idea that we must live at all costs is also not informed by a rounded view of society. What about the majority of us in this room? I mean, it's not informed by us. That is just informed by privileging an old and perhaps archaic and outmoded way of thinking about life and how you need to preserve it no matter what. And that's the view of society it's expressing, and we're challenging that view. We must consider the impact of the decision beyond our affluent suburbs and into our crowded townships. Yes, of course we should. That's true. Which is why I've been talking about legislation and why others have been talking about ways of regulating this. But the other thing that's relevant here, and there are at least 2 MPs in the room, I haven't looked very attentively, but at least 2. The other relevant thing here is that what this clause reminds us is that it's no good having a technical right if you can't actually enforce it or use it. Take abortion as a counterexample. By anecdotal accounts, there's only one nurse in a state hospital in this province who's willing to provide abortions. Yeah, so poor people can't get them because they can't afford Murray Stopes. Yeah, so simple policy fix, perhaps, you give them a voucher for Murray Stopes at a provincial hospital or something like that. I know it's not my job to do this, but we need to find a way to make things available. But at the same time, my concern is that I don't want to force people to kill other people, right? So I also find it uncomfortable to say to state doctors that you have this job, that you need to actually practice whatever we're going to do, whether it's assisted dying or euthanasia or whatever. And that's a difficult policy problem to solve, providing access and not forcing people to do things that are unconscionable. However, we're saying, so the other bill that MP Carter was talking about, the Section 6 of the Civil Union Act, is going to require government officials to do gay marriages, which I wholeheartedly endorse. So notice the inconsistency. I'm saying I'm willing to let people be forced to provide gay marriages, but I'm finding it uncomfortable to say they should be forced to provide euthanasia. Okay, so I'm just realizing that inconsistency now, so please don't ask me questions about it. However, I'm just illustrating how difficult these issues are. Thank you. On this playing God thing, okay, so on the Ambrosini on the Stransham Ford case, our health minister said that only God can decide when a person dies, which is patently absurd. When we take antibiotics, we are deciding when a person dies. Okay? So it's a completely inconsistent position to hold. We do this all the time. It's not a coherent position to hold. The idea that when we treat somebody in a beneficent way, that we're not playing God, is indistinguishable from the idea that we end lives. We suddenly aren't allowed to do that, right? When we drive our cars, we're playing God. When we wear spectacles, we're playing God, because our noses weren't designed to be bridges for these, or to provide a bridge for these eyeglasses, or whatever it might be. It's just patently nonsense. And also, when we talk about life as a gift, I'm often driven to ask, well, now, what kind of a gift is it if you're forced to suffer for decades or years or whatever the case might be? And at some point, you start to wonder about the virtues or the ethics of the gift giver if they give you this horrible gift that involves awful suffering and you can't give it back and say, I don't want this anymore, right? So that seems like a particularly morally odious sort of gift giver we're talking about. You're, in a sense, a slave rather than somebody who's been given a gift. The background art you would have heard about yesterday. It's an artist's representation of the sark, of the 3D printed. Of course, we don't have 3D printers that good yet, but a 3D printed machine that can assist you to kill yourself. So just briefly, as I was saying just now, it should be an opt-in sort of thing. If you're religious, you don't have to do it, right? And if you think that it's a moral evil, you don't have to do it. But for the rest of us, it should be opt-in. And I think for physicians, it should be too, although, as I say, that's tricky. Measures for this, advanced directives and living wills are included, but then also legislation to safeguard against abuses. And we can say that physicians need to account to a body of their peers. They can be disbarred, not disbarred, but struck off the roll or whatever if they abuse it. You can build in all sorts of things, and you can make it incredibly cumbersome, which of course would be counterproductive, or you can make it incredibly lax, which will lead to abuses. And we play with these things and find a balance over time. Our fears aren't really a good reason to avoid even trying. And there will not be a stampede or a rush. My colleague David Benatar has a book in which he talks about humans and our propensity towards the Pollyanna principle and the idea of you always thinking life is actually better than it is. We're prone to be optimistic. You, of course, hopefully know that lemmings don't actually do this, but this is just for effect, lemmings jumping off a cliff, but it's not true. So there won't be a rush. What about palliative care? Somebody asked earlier on today whether these things are competing or complementary. They're very much complementary. But palliative care is not enough for everybody. Some patients will not have their pain properly relieved during palliative care, even though it might work for most people. So that's one reason to allow for more, in other words, assisted dying. Dependency, some patients may prefer death to being dependent on other people to live. They hate relying on other people for their basic bodily functions, etc. A lack of home care. Some people might not want palliative care because it means they can't die at home. In some cases. Some people might prefer to be able to say goodbye to their friends and family while they're still alert. Okay, so that again argues for a more accelerated option of exit. And some people might just feel helpless and distressed and might not even be in the final stages but think, I've had enough, it's time. Okay, so palliative care will work for many cases, and I'm not saying it should at all be replaced. I think it should be strengthened where possible, but it's not, and these things aren't mutually exclusive. They can both work, and they're both very important parts of our healthcare matrix. Thank you. Yeah, I've basically spoken about that. Just a point there that refusing living wills, if we're talking about playing God, refusing to respect a living will, I think, is an example of playing God. There's a Dutch example from The Guardian about a month ago of somebody pointing out the catch-22 of being in sound mind and body and writing up your living will. And by the time it gets to you having extreme dementia and you ask to assent to your living will, you can no longer do so, right? And the doctors then keep you alive. We've got to fix those sorts of problems. We should assist dying for other reasons too, positive reasons. We're going to live longer, consume more resources, etc. We can have ecological benefits from ending lives where those are voluntarily ended, and economic benefits. There's an example of that I can tell you about over tea if you like. And in conclusion, we should remind ourselves that norms change. Things, as I said earlier on, gay marriage or homosexuality generally, voting rights, vegetarianism. There are many examples of our moral norms changing, and this one will change too. And as all of you who follow it know, it has been sweeping across the US and Canada, and of course the Benelux states rapidly, and has been changing. Our resources are limited. We can't look after everybody at the same level, so people want to relieve us of the burden. That's great. Protect dignity at all costs. Beware the false choice of being drawn into Hitler comparisons or something like that, because then we're not talking about the same thing at all, and accept that change and progress is slow and that we're doing a good job and we should keep at it. Thank you very much.